A military dog broke formation. During the mission, then, the truth came out. The village had no name on the official maps anymore. Just a grid coordinate, a red circle, and 3 words typed in bold at the top of the mission file. Do not hesitate. Staff Sergeant Daniel Rourke had read that file 4 times. Not because he needed to, he had it memorized, but because reading it again gave his hands something to do while the helicopter hummed around him, and the darkness outside pressed flat against the windows like something alive. 7 operators. 1 objective. 0 margin. He folded the paper, tucked it into his vest pocket, looked across the cabin. Rex was already awake. The dog sat upright between 2 gear bags, perfectly still in the way only military working dogs could manage. Not relaxed, not tense, but calibrated. His coat was dark sable, the kind of brown-black that disappeared in low light. 82 pounds of Belgian Malinois, 4 years old with a scar above his left eye from a training incident nobody talked about anymore. His ears moved independently of each other, tracking the hum of the rotors, the shift of weight in the cabin, the breathing patterns of every man present. His eyes found Rourke, held. Rourke gave him a single nod. Rex looked away. 2 minutes, said the pilot through the comm. The cabin changed. Not dramatically. There were no war cries, no dramatic helmet checks, just a collective tightening. Gloves pulled on, weapons verified, breathing slowed by choice. Captain Miles Taggart moved from the front of the cabin without a word, crouching between the operators and making eye contact with each one in sequence. Taggart was 41, compact, with the kind of face that had stopped being readable years ago. He had led 23 operations. He'd never lost a man on entry. He paused in front of Rourke. Rex is cleared for point approach, he said quietly. He goes in on your mark, not before. Understood. And Rourke, sir, if he signals on anything, you stop the column. Don't wait for me. Rourke nodded. Taggart moved on. The helicopter didn't land. It hovered 6 feet above a dirt clearing, and they dropped one by one into the dark. Rex last, lowered by harness with the practiced ease of an animal who had done this more times than most of the men beside him. The rotors faded. The silence that replaced them was immediate and total. The village materialized slowly as their eyes adjusted. Low structures, crumbling walls, a water tower with no water. 3 roads in, 2 roads out, both confirmed compromised by intelligence. The only viable route was the corridor, a narrow passage between 2 rows of collapsed buildings, roughly 90 meters long, opening onto the central courtyard where the target structure stood. Textbook entry point, clean sightlines on paper. Taggart signaled the formation. The column moved. Rex walked at Rourke's left side, slightly ahead, his nose working in slow, deliberate sweeps. Not frantic, not distracted, methodical, like a machine that happened to breathe. Rourke watched him the way a pilot watches an instrument panel, not for what it said, for what it stopped saying. 30 meters into the corridor, the village was exactly what intelligence had described. Abandoned, decayed, empty. 50 meters in, it was still exactly that. 70 meters in, Rourke began to feel the particular quiet that had nothing to do with sound. He'd felt it twice before in his career, once in Kandahar, once outside Mosul. He didn't say anything. There was nothing concrete to report, just a feeling that the air had shifted slightly, that something in the geometry of the place was wrong in a way he couldn't name. He looked down at Rex. Rex's nose had stopped moving. It was pointed at the ground. Taggart's hand signal came from the front. Advance. Rourke gave Rex the forward command. A tap on the left shoulder. The signal they had practiced 600 times. Rex did not move. What would you do if the most reliable member of your team suddenly refused a direct order, and you had less than 3 seconds to decide whether to trust them? The forward command had never failed. Not in 4 years of deployment. Not in 211 training repetitions. Not once in any condition under any level of stress had Rex received that tap and stayed still. Rourke gave it again. Rex didn't move. The column behind them compressed instinctively. 3 operators closing the gap without being told, weapons rising, eyes scanning the walls on both sides of the corridor. Nobody spoke. Taggart was already turning from the front of the formation, his expression unreadable but his pace fast. Handler. His voice was low, flat. Get your dog moving. He's not responding to forward. A beat of silence that lasted longer than it should have. Then pull him and take point yourself. Rourke reached for Rex's vest handle. Standard containment grip. Firm, practiced. the kind that moved even a resistant animal within 2 steps. Rex went sideways, not panicked, not aggressive. A clean pivot, deliberate, like he'd already decided where he was going, and Rourke's hand was simply an obstacle to route around. He broke left out of formation and moved 8 feet ahead down the corridor, angling slightly off the original path before stopping again. Then he lowered his nose to within an inch of the ground and barked. Once, twice, a third time, sharp, percussive, insistent. "Contain that animal," Taggart said. "Sir, now, Rourke." Rourke didn't move. He stood with his hand still outstretched from the failed grip, watching Rex work the ground in tight, focused circles. He had seen Rex alert on narcotics, on human remains, on weapon caches hidden inside walls. He had never seen him bark at open ground. Something was under there. "Sir," Rourke kept his voice even. "Request EOD assessment before we continue." The corridor went very quiet. Taggart looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at Rex, still circling, still working, nose dragging across the packed dirt like he was trying to read something written too small for anyone else to see. Taggart raised his fist. "Column halt. Martinez." His voice carried no urgency at all, which somehow made it worse. "Get up here." Corporal Elena Martinez moved from the middle of the column with her kit already open, passing the other operators without touching them, stepping around Rex without being told to give him space. She had been doing this for 6 years. She crouched at the edge of the area Rex was circling and didn't touch the ground yet, just looked, studied the surface. The way the dirt settled, the faint discoloration near the left edge of the corridor, barely visible, the kind of thing a camera wouldn't catch and a tired eye would file away as shadow. She looked up at Taggart. "Give me 4 minutes." Nobody spoke for those 4 minutes. Rex sat down at the edge of the area and did not move. His breathing had steadied. His ears were still. He watched Martinez work with the focused patience of an animal that understood, in whatever way animals understood things, that the next part was not his job. Rourke stood behind him and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time on a mission. He felt afraid, not of what was under the ground, of how close they had come to walking over it. 73 meters into a 90-meter corridor. 6 operators behind him. The blast radius of a pressure-activated IED in a confined space. He didn't finish the calculation. Martinez sat back on her heels. "It's there," she said quietly. "Right of center, 18 inches down. Pressure plate. Wiring consistent with the compound series we flagged in the regional brief last month." She paused. If the column had continued at current spacing, the lead element would have triggered it at approximately the 78th meter mark. Taggart said nothing for a moment. "Can you disarm it in place?" "Not safely. Not here. Not tonight." Another silence. "Then we mark it and we find another route." He looked at Rourke. "Get your dog." Rourke walked forward and crouched beside Rex. He put one hand on the dog's chest, felt the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of him against the cold air of the corridor. Rex turned his head and looked at him directly, not with urgency now, not with the focused alertness of a working dog mid-task. Just looked at him, the way he sometimes did at the end of a long training day, something that wasn't quite calm and wasn't quite relief, but existed somewhere between the two. Rourke kept his hand on Rex's chest for a moment longer than necessary. Then he stood and the column reformed around them and they moved back the way they'd come to find another way through. The secondary route added 11 minutes. 11 minutes through collapsed structures over rubble that shifted underfoot, past doorways that opened onto nothing. Taggart pushed the pace without acknowledging that he was pushing it. Nobody commented on the detour, nobody mentioned the corridor, but everyone knew. The math was simple and nobody wanted to do it out loud. The target structure came into view at 0217, a 2-story building at the center of the courtyard, concrete, with the upper floor partially collapsed on the eastern side. Intelligence had described it as a coordination point. Communications equipment, documents, possibly personnel. Low to medium resistance expected. Taggart assessed the exterior for 40 seconds, then signaled the entry team forward. Rex moved at Rourke's side, quieter now, his alerting done. He worked the perimeter of the structure in the methodical sweep that came before entry, checking the base of the walls, the threshold, the ground immediately outside the main door. Clean. He sat at the door and looked back at Rourke. Clear. They went in. The ground floor was a single large room that had once been something else. A shop, maybe, or a warehouse. The shelving was still bolted to the walls, empty. A folding table in the center held a portable radio and 3 plastic water bottles, 2 of them still sealed. A sleeping mat was pushed against the far wall, recently used. A lantern, still warm to the touch. Someone had been here within the last few hours. Taggart moved through the room without touching anything. Rourke watched him catalog it. The small inventory of evidence, the signs of a presence that had recently evacuated. Not fled, evacuated. There was a difference, and both of them knew what it meant. They had been expected. Upper floor, Taggart said. The staircase was narrow, the steps uneven where the concrete had cracked and settled. Rex went up first, Rourke close behind, the beam of his light cutting across walls that had been written on. Not graffiti, but notations, measurements, diagrams that meant nothing to Rourke, but would mean something to the analysts who photographed them in the morning. The upper floor was smaller. The eastern section opened to the sky where the roof had come down. What remained was a single room with a window that looked back toward the corridor where they had stopped. Rourke stood at the window and looked out. From here, the approach was fully visible. The entire 90-meter length of it, both walls, the entry point from the northern side. A clear view of any formation moving through. He stood very still. Rex was beside him, looking out the same window, ears forward. Someone had stood here. Someone had watched the corridor and waited. The position was deliberate, far enough back from the glass to avoid silhouette, close enough to observe everything below. On the floor near the window was a small scuff mark in the dust, the compressed outline of a knee. Rourke thought about the water bottles downstairs. 2 sealed, 1 empty. 1 person, waiting long enough to need water, watching the corridor long enough to need patience, watching the route they were supposed to take. He turned and found Taggart in the doorway behind him. Someone was watching the approach, Rourke said. Taggart looked at the window, then at the floor, then at the corridor beyond the glass. He didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window and stood where Rourke had stood and looked out for a long time. They left before we arrived, he finally said. Yes, sir. But they were here. Yes, sir. Taggart was quiet for another moment. Outside, the village held its silence in the way abandoned places do, not peacefully, but like something that had learned to wait. They knew our route, Rourke said. It wasn't a question. Taggart looked at him, then back at the corridor. Martinez. He keyed his comm. The device in the corridor, did it look improvised or placed? A pause. Placed, sir. Professionally. Not something you do in a hurry. Taggart said nothing. He turned from the window and moved back toward the staircase, and Rourke followed him. And Rex followed Rourke. And the 3 of them went back down into the empty room where the lantern had cooled, and the radio sat silent, and the water bottles stood in a row like they were waiting for someone to come back and finish them. Nobody was coming back, but someone had left in enough time and in enough order to suggest they would be somewhere else by now, somewhere they'd planned to be. Taggart stood in the center of the room and looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked at Rex. Rex looked back at him, still and calm, ears slightly forward. What else does he know? Taggart said. That we don't. It wasn't directed at Rourke. It wasn't directed at anyone. He turned and walked toward the door. Pull everything, we're done here. Martinez found the second wire at 0241, not by looking for it. By stepping on the edge of a loose stone near the courtyard wall and feeling, in the half-second before her weight shifted, something that wasn't dirt give beneath the surface. She froze, called it in with 2 words. Didn't move again until Rourke brought Rex to her position and let him work the ground in a slow expanding circle from where she stood. Rex found 4 more, not devices, wires, thin, low gauge, running just beneath the surface of the courtyard in a pattern that only became visible once you knew what you were looking for, branching outward from the center of the space like the roots of something planted months ago. They ran toward the walls, toward the corridor entrance, toward the secondary route the team had used when they rerouted, toward both ways out. Martinez mapped them on her tablet without speaking. The others held position and watched her work, and nobody said what everyone was thinking, which was that this was not an ambush. An ambush was reactive. This was a diagram, a sequence. Someone had looked at the approach to this structure and drawn lines between points and decided, with patience and geometry, how to ensure that whatever came in did not come back out. The IED in the corridor had not been the trap. It had been the beginning of it. Taggart crouched beside Martinez and studied the tablet. The wires converged on 3 detonation points, 2 at the courtyard walls, 1 beneath the stone floor near the center. Sequential triggering, The corridor device would have taken the lead element. The survivors falling back or pushing forward would have entered the courtyard, and the courtyard would have finished it. He looked up at Rourke. Rourke was already looking at him. Neither of them spoke. Rex had stopped moving. He stood at the edge of the wire pattern with his nose raised, not working the ground anymore but testing the air. Slow, deliberate pulls, his whole body oriented toward the eastern wall of the courtyard, the one with the collapsed section where the rubble had spilled outward into the open space. Rourke watched him. Rex took one step toward the wall. "Hold," Rourke said quietly. Rex stopped, but his nose kept working. Rourke walked to him, crouched, put his face close to the dogs and looked where Rex was looking. The rubble, the broken concrete, the shadows between the fallen sections where the darkness was layered and complete. He keyed his comm. "I need a light on the east wall." Low and slow, the beam swept across. Stone, dust, the rusted rebar jutting from the broken sections like bones from a wound. A tarp, partially buried under a slab, the kind of olive drab that could be anything. And at the far edge of the light where the wall met the ground, the small regular outline of something that had no business being organic. A case, military grade, locked. Taggart was beside him before Rourke stood up. They looked at it for a moment. Rex had not moved. He was still oriented toward the wall, but his attention had shifted slightly, not to the case now, but to the space above it, where a gap in the rubble opened onto the collapsed upper section of the eastern wall. A gap just wide enough for a person to have moved through. Recently, the dust at the edges of the gap was disturbed, not from the structural collapse. That would have settled months ago. This was fresh disturbance. Scuff marks at the base where someone had climbed through quickly and not cared about being careful. Someone who had left in a hurry. Someone who had not expected to need to. Rourke turned slowly and looked back at the courtyard. The wires. The 3 detonation points. The corridor behind them. The secondary route they'd taken by chance, rerouted because Rex had stopped moving 73 meters into a 90-meter corridor. He looked at Rex. Rex was looking at the gap in the wall. Still, alert. Not pulling forward. Not signaling danger ahead. Just looking, the way he sometimes looked at a door after someone had walked through it. Tracking a presence that was no longer there but had been, recently and certainly, close enough to matter. Someone had been on the other side of that wall when they entered the courtyard. Someone who had watched them come in and waited, and then at some point between entry and now, had decided not to stay, had decided to leave the case behind. Rourke thought about that, about the decision it represented, about what kind of calculation produced it, the kind that weighed what you were carrying against how fast you needed to move and chose speed. Whatever was in the case, they had left it, and Rex had found both things, the network of wires that would have destroyed the team, and the absence of the person who had been waiting to trigger them. Taggart crouched in front of the case. Martinez. She was already moving. Rourke stayed where he was and put his hand on Rex's back, between the shoulder blades, and kept it there. The dog's muscles were still with a tension that was not fear. Rex did not do fear, not in the field, not in the way Rourke understood it, but something adjacent to it. The particular stillness of an animal that has processed more information than it can express and is waiting for the humans around it to catch up. From somewhere beyond the eastern wall, in the dark geometry of the village, there was a sound, not loud, not close. Footsteps on rubble, moving fast, moving away. Rex turned his head toward it. His ears came fully forward. Then the sound was gone and the village was silent again, and Martinez was opening the case, and whatever it contained was about to change the shape of everything they thought they knew about tonight. The case contained documentation, not weapons, not communications equipment, paper, printed, organized, clipped into sections with the kind of bureaucratic precision that felt obscene in a place like this. Martinez photographed every page without reading them. That was protocol. Understanding was someone else's job, but Taggart read them. He stood with the case open at his feet and worked through the pages slowly, his light angled low, and the expression on his face changed in a way Rourke had never seen before. Not alarm, not anger, something quieter than both of those things, and worse. He closed the case. "We need to move," he said. Now. Nobody asked why. The tone didn't invite it. They reformed and moved back toward the courtyard exit, the same way they'd entered, picking through the wire network Martinez had mapped. Single file, measured steps, Rex at the front, working the ground out of habit more than necessity now. The threats here were catalogued, visible, known. What Taggart had seen in those pages was something else entirely. They were 40 meters from the courtyard exit when Rex stopped again. Different this time. Not the slow, methodical halt of detection. A sudden stop. Full body weight dropped back onto his haunches. The posture Rourke associated with a category of alert that had nothing to do with the ground beneath them. Elevated threat. Present. Close. Rourke's hand was already on Rex's vest. "Contact," he said quietly into the comm. "Rex is alerting. Direction unknown." The column froze. For 3 seconds the courtyard was completely silent. The shot came from the northern wall. Single round. Suppressed but not silent. The crack arrived a half-beat after the impact, which meant distance, which meant a position elevated above the courtyard floor. Rourke felt Rex lurch against his grip, and then the dog was down, on his side, and Rourke was down beside him before he'd consciously decided to move. "Shooter north wall," someone called. "High position." 2 operators returned fire immediately, targeting the wall's upper section, the broken parapet where the angle was right. A third pulled Taggart low. Martinez was already flat against the courtyard floor, the case clutched against her chest. Rourke had both hands on Rex. The round had caught him along the left flank, high. A graze, not a penetration. The kind of wound that bled fast and looked catastrophic and was survivable if you moved quickly. Rex was breathing. Rapid, shallow. The involuntary panting of an animal in acute pain, but breathing. His eyes were open and oriented toward Rourke with a focus that was almost unbearable in its steadiness. Still working. Even now. "He's hit," Rourke said into the comm. "Flank graze. He needs evac." "We all need evac," someone said, not unkindly. The fire from the north wall had stopped. Either the shooter had repositioned or the return fire had found them. In the sudden silence, Rourke pressed his hand against Rex's flank and felt the heat of the wound and the fast rhythm of breathing beneath his palm, and did not look away from the dog's eyes. Taggart crawled to his position. "How bad?" "Manageable, if we move." Taggart looked at Rex for a moment, then at the courtyard exit, then back. "Can he walk?" Rourke looked down. Rex had already shifted his weight, pulling his front legs beneath him, attempting to rise with the automatic determination of an animal that did not recognize the option of staying down. "He's going to try," Rourke said. "Then we go." They moved fast and low, Rourke's hand on Rex's vest the entire way, taking the dog's weight on the turns where his legs faltered. The exit, the secondary route, the rubble field beyond the village perimeter where the ground opened up and the sky came back, and the helicopter's running lights were already visible 2 kilometers out, dropping fast. Rex made it to the extraction point under his own power. Barely, but under his own power. When they reached the clearing and the column broke formation and the operators moved to their positions around the perimeter, Rex sat down in the dirt beside Rourke and leaned, not collapsed, leaned, against his leg. Deliberate, chosen. The weight of him was warm and solid and real in a way that made Rourke's chest do something he didn't have a name for in a professional context. He put his hand on the dog's head. Rex exhaled slowly. Above them, the helicopter descended through the dark, and Taggart stood at the edge of the clearing with the case under his arm and his back to everyone, looking out at the village they were leaving behind. Whatever he had read in those pages, he hadn't shared it. Whatever it meant for the mission, for the intelligence that had sent them here, for the question of how completely they had been expected, that conversation was coming, and it would be someone else's room, someone else's rank. Tonight, they were alive to have it. All of them. Rourke looked down at Rex, whose eyes were half closed now, pain and exhaustion pulling at the edges of his focus, but not quite winning. He thought about the corridor, the tap on the shoulder, the 600 repetitions of a command that had never once failed, and the one night it needed to. The helicopter touched down. The official report took 11 days. Rourke read it once, in a break room at the base medical facility, while Rex slept in a kennel 14 meters down the hall with a drain in his flank and a cone around his neck that he tolerated with the dignity of an animal that understood indignity was temporary. The report was accurate in its facts and careful in its language. It documented the IED discovery, the wire network, the recovered case, the contact at extraction. It noted that the primary route had been abandoned due to a handler-directed tactical reassessment. It used that phrase twice. Handler-directed tactical reassessment. It did not mention that Rex had refused a direct command. It did not mention the 3 seconds Rourke had stood with his hand outstretched and chosen. without authorization, and without certainty, not to force compliance. Those 3 seconds were not in the report. They existed only in the specific silence of everyone who had been in that corridor, and in the way Taggart had looked at him on the helicopter. Not with gratitude exactly, but with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he'd already finished calculating. The documents in the case had confirmed what the position in the upper floor had suggested. The operation had been anticipated. The route had been selected for them, fed through a channel that was still being traced by someone who understood how the team would move and where they would be most exposed. The IED in the corridor was not opportunistic. It was the first note of a sequence written specifically for them. Rex had not detected a random threat. He had detected the opening move of something designed to kill everyone Rourke had ever worked beside. Rourke sat with that for a while in the break room with the report in his hands and the coffee going cold beside him. On the day of the commendation, the ceremony was small. A room on base, no press, 8 people including the commanding officer who shook hands and said the right things in the right order. Rex sat beside Rourke in his working vest, the shaved patch on his flank still visible where the wound was closing clean. He sat straight and still and looked forward and did not perform anything for anyone in the room. When it was over, Rourke crouched beside him. He didn't say anything. There was nothing that translated. Rex was not waiting for an explanation or a summary or an acknowledgement of what he'd understood that night in the corridor. He had simply done what his nature and his training and whatever existed between those 2 things had asked of him, and now it was done. And the next thing would come when it came. Rourke put both hands on the dog's face. Rex held still. Outside the window, the base moved through its ordinary morning. Vehicles, voices, the specific mundane rhythm of a place that runs on routine because routine is what keeps the other things manageable. In 11 days, the report would be filed and the case would move to another desk, and the village with no name would remain a grid coordinate with a red circle around it. The wire network would be cleared by a different team. The shooter on the north wall had not been found. The channel that had fed their route to the other side was still open. Taggart was in a different building right now, in a room Rourke didn't have clearance for, working through whatever came next. That was his job. Rourke's job was the dog in front of him and the next mission after this one and the 600 repetitions that would happen between now and then. He stood up. Rex stood up with him, weight distributed evenly now, the favoring of the left side almost gone. He looked up at Rourke with the particular attention he reserved for moments of transition, the end of one thing, the beginning of another, the beat in between where the next command would come. Rourke looked back at him for a moment. Then he turned, and Rex fell into step at his left side, slightly ahead, and they walked out of the room together into the flat morning light. Nothing was said about what had happened in the corridor. Nothing needed to be. The people who had been there knew, and the people who hadn't would read handler-directed tactical reassessment and move on, and somewhere in the distance between those 2 things was the truth of it. Quiet, undecorated, and entirely sufficient. The base went on around them. Rex's nose was already working.